the haunted mill of Blackwater Creek. The old wooden boards of Blackwater Mill have watched over the Quebec River for more than 200 years. Its worn-out wood and rusty metal parts tell a story of good times, bad times, and something much scarier that still haunts this place today. Tonight, we explore the mystery of the mill that talks in whispers and the families who could never escape what it wanted. The story of Mill Haven, Maine starts like many small towns in New England, people working hard to build something new in the wild forest. The fast-moving waters of the Quebec River were perfect for running a mill. In 1753, a man with big dreams named Thaddius Blackwater saw a chance where others only saw wild trees and rocks. The huge building he built became the center of the town that would later be called Mill Haven. For 50 years, Blackwater Mill ground grain to make flour for the growing town. The big water will turn day and night, and the heavy stone will never stop crushing grain. But success built on pain and suffering never lasts long. And in the dark corners of Blackwater Mill, terrible things had happened that seeped into the very foundation stones. Like the dark flood waters that sometimes filled the lower floors when spring ice melted, the mill held dangerous secrets. Secrets that would eventually come out, whispered through time to anyone willing to listen. In the cold January of 1903, Thomas Harlow came to the small town of Mill Haven, Maine. He brought his wife Eleanor and their 2 children, James, who was 10 years old, and Abigail, who was 7. Thomas had bought the old mill for a surprisingly low price. He planned to turn the living space into a real home while using the grain mill to make money for his family. Thomas was 36 years old with the strong hands of a carpenter and the determined look of someone who had faced hard times but refused to give up. The money panic of 1893 had wiped out all his savings in Boston, where he had worked making furniture for 15 years. The 10 years after that had been a struggle, odd jobs here and there, rented rooms in worse and worse neighborhoods, and constant worry that showed on Eleanor's face, which used to be so happy and carefree. When the advertisement for the mill appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript newspaper, Thomas grabbed it like a drowning man reaching for something to save him. The ad said, "Historic grain mill with attached living quarters. Working machinery still good. Perfect for a family wanting independence and opportunity. Price can be discussed." The letters back and forth with the seller, a Mr. Harrison, had been short and strangely urgent. When the price was finally suggested, it was so surprisingly low that Thomas worried it might be some kind of trick. But the paperwork proved to be real and proper lawyers handled the sale. The trip from Boston had been hard. Their wagon creaked under the weight of everything they owned as it moved along the snowy roads. Eleanor held little Abigail close to her chest, and they could see the child's breath in the freezing air. James sat next to his father on the front bench, his eyes wide with both excitement and worry, as he saw their new home appearing through the bare winter trees. "There she is," Thomas announced, his voice trying to sound more excited than he really felt. "Blackwater Mill, our new beginning." Eleanor kept her face calm as she looked at the big, intimidating building. 3 stories of weathered wooden boards with a massive water wheel that was currently frozen in place by the partly iced-over river. A stone foundation supported the wooden frame, and a strange 8-sided tower rose from one corner of the building like a guard watching over the property. Eleanor Harlow had grown up in a well-off Boston family. She was the daughter of a bookkeeper who had made sure his only child got an education that was unusual for women in those days. She had met Thomas at a church social event in 1890, attracted by his honest manner and skilled hands. Her parents had not liked the match, "just a tradesman," they had said with disapproval. But Eleanor had seen something in Thomas that her parents missed: honesty and quiet determination. Their early marriage had been happy, blessed with 2 healthy children and modest comfort. Then came the financial collapse, her father's death, and the slow slide into poverty that had led them here to this remote mill in the Maine wilderness. She smoothed a loose strand of reddish-brown hair back into her simple bun, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face whatever waited for them inside. For Thomas, for the children, she would make this work. "It looks old," James said, his young face scrunched up as he studied the building. "It was built in 1753, Thomas replied, pride creeping into his voice. "One of the oldest mills in Maine, but as solid as the day it was built, the previous owner assured me. Who was the previous owner? Eleanor asked, her first words in hours. Thomas hesitated. A Mr. Harrison. He inherited it from his father but had no interest in keeping it up, so he offered a good price. The wagon pulled up to the front of the mill, and Thomas helped his family down. The door creaked ominously as he pushed it open, showing a huge interior space. The ground floor housed the milling equipment, massive grinding stones, wooden chutes, and various machines for processing grain. A thick layer of dust covered everything, evidence of months, maybe years of not being used. The air inside had a strange quality, thick and still, carrying the smell of old wood, dust, and something else. Something undefined that made the hair on the back of Eleanor's neck stand up. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. Light filtered through dirty windows, lighting up tiny dust particles that swirled in the disturbed air like miniature stars. The mill equipment loomed in the half-light, the great wooden gears and wheels reminding them of a sleeping giant. The millstone itself dominated the center of the floor, a massive disk of granite with its surface carved with detailed patterns that had once helped channel grain to be ground into flour. James approached the stone, his fascination overcoming his initial fear. Is this where the wheat gets crushed, Father? Thomas nodded, placing a hand on the cold surface of the stone. Yes, son. The water you saw outside powers these mechanisms, which turn the millstone. The grain is fed through here. He pointed to a wooden funnel above, and is ground between this stone and another beneath it. The flour then falls through to be collected. Will we be grinding flour soon? James asked, excitement edging into his voice. Once the river thaws and we can get the wheel turning again, yes. We'll need to clean everything thoroughly first, and I'll need to check all the mechanisms to make sure they work properly. Thomas ran his hand along one of the wooden gears, leaving a clean streak in the dust. Mr. Harrison assured me that the equipment was working as recently as last autumn. It's very imposing, Eleanor commented, keeping a watchful eye on Abigail, who had not moved far from her mother's skirt since entering the building. Were erratic, the once neat handwriting growing increasingly messy. The numbers were sometimes crossed out or corrected multiple times. The very last entry, dated October 17, 1902, consisted of a single sentence. It has begun again. The words were underlined 3 times, the pen having torn through the paper in places. By midday, a visitor arrived. Silas Codell, the town's elderly shopkeeper, came bearing a basket of supplies and unmistakable curiosity. Silas was a fixture in Mill Haven. His family had operated the general store since before the Revolutionary War. His bent frame and wrinkled features gave him the appearance of a man who had seen more than his share of winters. Yet his eyes remained bright and alert beneath bushy white eyebrows. He wore a heavy woolen coat against the January cold and a knitted scarf wrapped multiple times around his thin neck. "Thought you folks might need some essentials," he explained, eyes darting around the interior of the mill as Eleanor invited him in. "Not many supplies to be had until the spring thaw brings the traders through." "That's very kind," Eleanor replied, accepting the basket. She peered inside to find bread, cheese, salt pork, and several jars of preserved vegetables. "We are fortunate to have such thoughtful neighbors." "It's nothing," Silas said humbly, stamping snow from his boots. "Mill Haven looks after its own, or those who aim to be its own." At any rate, he accepted the offer of tea, and soon they were seated at the kitchen table, the steaming brew providing welcome warmth. "How are you finding the old mill?" Silas asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Getting settled in all right?" "It needs work," Thomas admitted. "But the structure is sound. The machinery appears to be in good condition as well. Once spring comes, I believe we can establish a profitable operation." Silas nodded absently, his attention caught by the open door to the tower room. "I see you've taken up residence properly then. Not many have stayed more than a few nights." Thomas, who had come upstairs at the sound of a visitor, frowned. "And why is that, Mr. Codell?" The old man shifted uncomfortably on the hard kitchen chair. "No particular reason. Old place like this, drafty and remote. Not to everyone's liking. But you implied others have tried, Thomas pressed. Silas sighed, appearing to make a decision. Look here, Mr. Harlow. I'm not one for gossip or ghost stories. But since you've brought your family, you ought to know. There's talk about this mill. Has been for generations. Eleanor instinctively moved closer to her children, who had paused in their chores to listen. James's expression was one of fascination, while Abigail seemed to shrink into herself, her small face tight with anxiety. Every 50 years, almost to the day, families who live here report disturbances. Started back in 1803, far as anyone knows. Maybe earlier, but that's the first written account we have. What kind of disturbances? Thomas asked, his doubt evident in his tone. Whispers, Silas replied simply. Always the same words, from what's been passed down. The wheel turns, the stone grinds, and then, he paused. Well, misfortune tends to follow. Abigail gasped, and Eleanor placed a protective hand on her shoulder. What sort of misfortune? Thomas demanded. Silas glanced at the children and shook his head slightly. Perhaps a conversation for another time, Mr. Harlow. I've said more than I intended already. Town council wouldn't thank me for scaring off new blood before you've even settled. He drained his tea and stood, retrieving his hat from the table. Just be watchful is all. And if you hear anything unusual, perhaps consider a brief stay in town until it passes. Until what passes? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas paused at the door. The anniversary, February 17th. It was on that date in 1803 that Thaddius Blackwater met his end in this very mill, and every 50 years since, something remembers. With that mysterious statement, he departed, leaving the Harlow family in uneasy silence. After Silas left, a tense silence fell over the Harlow family. Thomas finally broke it with a dismissive laugh. Superstitious nonsense. Every small town has its ghost stories. Keeps the winter evenings entertaining when there's little else to do. But Abigail heard, Eleanor began. A coincidence, Thomas interrupted firmly. The child heard the wind, nothing more. James, who had been quiet during Silas's visit, now spoke up. What if it's true, Father? What if the mill really is haunted? The boy's voice held equal measures of fear and excitement. Thomas ruffled his son's hair affectionately. There are no such things as ghosts, James. Mr. Codell is simply repeating old folk tales. In Boston, they told stories of pirates' ghosts haunting the harbor. In Salem, it was witches. Here, it seems to be the ghost of a miller. All cut from the same cloth, stories to frighten children and entertain adults. But she knew what Abigail heard, Eleanor persisted. The exact words. A common phrase associated with milling, Thomas reasoned. Nothing supernatural about it. The wheel turns. The stone grinds. It's simply a description of how a mill operates. Eleanor was not convinced, but she recognized the stubborn set of her husband's jaw. Thomas had invested everything they had in this venture. He could not afford to entertain doubts. Not now. Not when their very survival depended on making the mill successful. Perhaps you're right, she conceded, though her eyes betrayed her lingering concern. Come, children, let's continue unpacking. There's still much to do before nightfall. As January progressed, the Harlow family settled into a routine. Thomas spent his days repairing and maintaining the mill equipment, while Eleanor established their household. James and Abigail, after completing their daily lessons at the kitchen table, were permitted to explore the surrounding woods under strict instructions not to venture onto the frozen river. January in Maine was a study in endurance. Snow fell almost daily, building great drifts against the mill's walls. The wind howled down the river valley, finding every crack and gap in the old building. At night, the temperature dropped severely, forcing the family to sleep huddled close to the fireplace, which Thomas kept fed with a steady supply of wood from the shed behind the mill. Yet despite the hardships, there were moments of beauty and even joy. The crystal-like quality of the winter light as it streamed through frost-patterned windows, the tracks of deer and rabbits in the pristine snow, the quiet evenings spent reading aloud from the few books they had brought with them, or singing the old songs that had been passed down through generations. Eleanor heard it while hanging laundry in the upstairs room that caught the best midday sun. A woman's voice, close to her ear. The wheel turns. The stone grinds. James heard it while collecting kindling near the frozen mill race. The same words carried on a breeze that disturbed no leaves. Even Thomas, firm in his disbelief, woke one night to the whispered phrase, seemingly spoken from the empty rocking chair in the corner of their bedroom. Only when the whispers were followed by a name did Thomas finally acknowledge that something truly unexplainable was occurring. Each family member reported the same experience. After the familiar phrase, a single word was added. It happened first to Abigail. She had been helping her mother in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening bread, when she suddenly went still, her small hands covered in flour, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "Abigail?" Eleanor had asked, concerned by her daughter's sudden trance-like state. "Abigail, what is it?" "She's here again," the child whispered. "The lady. She's trying to warn us." "Warn us about what, darling?" "About him. About Thaddius. She says he's getting stronger." Eleanor had called for Thomas then, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. By the time he arrived, Abigail had returned to normal, though she had no memory of her strange statement. That night, it was James who woke the household with a terrified cry. Thomas and Eleanor rushed into their son's room to find him sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide and unseeing. "The wheel turns, the stone grinds," he chanted in a voice not quite his own. "Thaddius is coming." Thomas shook his son gently. "James, wake up. You're having a nightmare." The boy blinked rapidly, his eyes clearing as he recognized his parents. "Father, what happened?" "You were dreaming, son," Thomas assured him, though the chill that had settled in his chest contradicted his confident tone. 2 nights later, it was Eleanor who heard the expanded whisper. She had been about to drift off to sleep when a breath of icy air brushed across her face. The whisper came as it had before. "The wheel turns, the stone grinds," but this time followed by "Thaddius grows restless." She sat bolt upright, clutching the quilt to her chest. Thomas, awakened by her sudden movement, lit the bedside candle. "What is it?" he asked, blinking in the sudden light. "I heard it again," Eleanor whispered. The voice, but this time it mentioned a name. "Thaddius?" Thomas frowned, remembering what Silas had told them about Thaddius Blackwater, the original mill owner who had died in 1803. "It was just a dream, Eleanor, influenced by what Codell told us." But Eleanor shook her head firmly. "It wasn't a dream, Thomas. I was still awake. And it's not just me. Both children have heard the same name." The name meant nothing to the Harlows, but Thomas resolved to investigate. His first stop was the town records housed in a small building next to the church. The elderly record-keeper, Mrs. Winters, peered at him over wire-rimmed spectacles as he explained his inquiry. "What name you say, in connection with the mill?" She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "That would be Thaddius Blackwater, I suspect, the original mill owner. Built the place in 1753, operated it until his death in—" She disappeared into the rows of shelves, returning with a leather-bound volume. "Yes, here it is. Died in 1803, rather unpleasantly, if the accounts are to be believed." Mrs. Winters was a fixture of Mill Haven, as much a repository of local history as the records she maintained. Her family had served as town clerks for generations, and at 72, she showed no signs of giving up her position. Her small office smelled of dust, leather, and the peppermint drops she kept in a cut-glass dish on her desk. The walls were lined with shelves holding ledgers, journals, and bound documents dating back to the town's founding. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. Mrs. Winters studied him for a moment before responding. "Crushed by his own millstone. A terrible accident, or so it was ruled. There were rumors, though." "What kind of rumors?" The elderly woman's fingers traced the faded ink on the page before her. "That it wasn't an accident at all. that Blackwater wasn't well liked. Harsh man treated his workers poorly. Some said he worked children to exhaustion in that mill. Orphans mostly, who had no one to speak for them. Children in the mill. Thomas was appalled. Even in his limited experience with mill operations, he knew the dangers such machinery posed. Different times, Mr. Harlow, Mrs. Winters said with a sad shake of her head. And Blackwater was particularly ruthless. The children were cheap labor, often acquired from orphanages in Boston or Portland for little more than the cost of their transport. He worked them 16 hours a day, sometimes more, fed them just enough to keep them alive. Some died from exhaustion or accidents with the machinery. Others simply disappeared. Thomas felt a chill despite the warmth of the records room. And no one intervened? Blackwater was the most powerful man in Mill Haven at the time. The town depended on the mill. And orphans. Well, who was there to speak for them? She sighed heavily. It was a different time, Mr. Harlow. Not a better one in many ways. And after his death, the mill passed to his son, who sold it almost immediately. Couldn't leave town fast enough, by all accounts. Since then, it's changed hands regularly. No one stays long. She gave him a pointed look. Especially not families with children. That evening, Thomas shared what he had learned with Eleanor, speaking in hushed tones after the children were asleep. They sat in the kitchen, a single oil lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind moaned through the gaps, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called mournfully. Thomas had built up the fire in the stove, but Eleanor still kept her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as much for comfort as for warmth. So we have the name of a man who died 100 years ago, Eleanor whispered. That explains nothing about what we're experiencing, Thomas. Thomas cupped his hands around his mug of tea, drawing what warmth he could from it. The brew had gone cold, but he had barely noticed, his mind too occupied with what he had learned. There's more, Thomas admitted reluctantly. I spoke with Silas Codell again. He filled in some details Mrs. Winters was reluctant to share. Apparently, in 1853, 50 years after Blackwater's death, a family named Prescott lived in the mill. They reported hearing whispers for weeks. Then their young son disappeared. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Disappeared. Thomas nodded grimly. Found a week later in the mill race, drowned. The family claimed he had been lured there by a voice. Eleanor's face had gone pale in the lamplight. And 50 years later, that would be 1903, this year. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. The last family to live here was the Harrisons. They left in a hurry last autumn. Mr. Harrison sold me the mill through letters. He refused to return to Mill Haven even to complete the sale. Did Silas say what happened to them? To the Harrisons? Thomas hesitated. He said they began hearing the whispers in early October. By the end of the month, they were gone, packed up in the middle of the night and fled. Left most of their belongings behind. Did they have children? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 2 daughters, ages 9 and 6. He didn't need to elaborate on the similarity to their own family. Eleanor rose from her chair, pacing the room. We need to leave, Thomas. Take the children and go tonight if possible. And go where? We've invested everything in this mill. If we abandon it now, we'll be destitute. Thomas sighed heavily. Besides, these are just stories, Eleanor. Tragic coincidences strung together by superstitious minds. And the whispers? The name? Are those coincidences too? Thomas had no answer for that. He stared into his cold tea as if it might contain some solution to their predicament. Eleanor was right to be frightened. He was frightened himself, though he struggled to admit it. But she was also right about their financial situation. They had spent nearly every penny they possessed on purchasing the mill and relocating to Mill Haven. If they left now, they would have nowhere to go and no means of supporting themselves. Perhaps we could stay in town for a few weeks, he suggested finally. At the inn. Or maybe Silas Codell would know of a family willing to take us in temporarily. Just until this anniversary date passes. Eleanor's relief was obvious. Yes, that would be sensible. We could say the living quarters need more extensive repairs than we initially thought. No one need know the real reason. Before Thomas could respond, a soft thud from above drew their attention. Both parents froze, listening intently. Another thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of the rocking chair in the tower room creaking rhythmically. Without a word, they rushed upstairs, Thomas grabbing an oil lamp as they went. The door to the tower room stood slightly open, though Eleanor was certain it had been closed earlier. Thomas pushed it open wider, raising the lamp. The rocking chair moved slowly back and forth, though no one sat in it. As they watched, it gradually slowed and then stopped. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, their breath visible in the lamplight. "We should check on the children," Eleanor whispered, backing away from the doorway. They found James sound asleep in his bed, undisturbed by the noises. But when they entered Abigail's room, her bed was empty. "Abigail," Eleanor called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Abigail, darling, where are you?" Thomas lifted the lamp higher, lighting up every corner of the small room. The window was securely latched from the inside. The child's nightgown lay discarded on the floor beside her bed, as if she had changed clothes before leaving. But why would she do such a thing in the middle of a winter night? She must be in the house somewhere, Thomas reasoned, though his voice betrayed his growing alarm. "You check this floor. I'll look downstairs." Eleanor moved from room to room on the second floor, calling her daughter's name with increasing desperation. She checked under beds, inside wardrobes, behind furniture, anywhere a small girl might hide. She found nothing. A thorough search of the upper floors yielded nothing. It was Thomas who thought to check the milling floor below, an area they had forbidden the children from entering without supervision due to the dangerous equipment. "Eleanor!" His shout from below sent her rushing to the top of the spiral staircase. "I found her shoes by the mill door. It's been opened." Eleanor's heart seemed to stop. "She's outside in this cold?" The temperature had dropped severely after sunset, and a bitter wind had been howling around the building for hours. A child in the open without proper clothing would not survive long. Thomas was already pulling on his coat. "Stay with James. I'll find her." A chill ran through Eleanor despite the morning sun. "Did the lady tell you her name?" Abigail nodded. "Sarah. She said she's been trying to warn people, but no one leaves in time." Before Eleanor could ask more questions, Thomas called for them to board the wagon. As they prepared to depart, Silas Codell approached, looking grim. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The old man looked as if he had aged overnight. His shoulders stooped more noticeably beneath his heavy coat, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He leaned on a gnarled walking stick, its wood polished smooth by years of use. "This place is not what was advertised," Thomas replied stiffly. "Good day, Mr. Codell. I understand," Silas said softly. "The Harrisons left even more abruptly. At least you've had the courtesy to say farewell." He glanced at the mill, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. It always begins with the whispers. By the time the machinery starts moving on its own, there's not much time left. "You knew," Eleanor accused, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "You knew what would happen, yet you said nothing when we arrived." Silas nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I tried to warn you in my way, but would you have believed me if I told you the full truth? That a vengeful spirit haunts that mill, seeking to claim a child every 50 years? That no family with young ones has survived a February in that place since 1803. He shook his head sadly. "People don't believe such things until they experience them firsthand. And by then, it's often too late." "We're leaving now," Thomas said firmly. "That's all that matters." Silas nodded slowly. "Before you go, Mr. Harlow, there's something you should know. Something that might help the next unfortunate soul who takes up residence here." Despite his eagerness to be away, Thomas paused. "What is it?" "The cycle can be broken," Silas said quietly. "There's a journal in the town records. Belongs to a woman named Sarah Blackwater, Thaddius's wife. She documented everything. Her husband's cruelty, the children's revenge, and her own attempts to warn subsequent inhabitants. "Sarah," Eleanor whispered, exchanging a glance with Abigail. "According to her writings, Thaddius's spirit is bound to the millstone. As long as it remains intact, the cycle continues. 50 years of silence. Then the whispers begin anew, leading to another child taken." "Are you suggesting we destroy a massive granite millstone?" Thomas asked incredulously. Silas's weathered face creased in a humorless smile. "Not destroy, perhaps, but damage it sufficiently to break the binding." Sarah believed it could be done. She spent years researching folk magic and old rituals after her husband's death. She was determined to protect future children from his malice. "And did she attempt it herself?" Thomas inquired. "She tried," Silas confirmed, "but she lacked the physical strength to damage the stone significantly, and no one in town would help her, too afraid of Blackwater's curse. Even in death, his hold on Mill Haven was powerful." "Why are you telling us this now?" Eleanor demanded. "Why not when we first arrived?" Silas met her gaze steadily. "Would you have believed me then, Mrs. Harlow? Or would you have dismissed me as a superstitious old fool, as so many before you have done?" Eleanor had no answer for that. She knew that a month ago, she would indeed have scoffed at such tales. "I'm merely passing on information, Mr. Harlow," Silas continued. "What you do with it is your affair. Safe journey to you and your family." As the old man walked away, Thomas turned to his wife. "He's trying to delay us. The whole town probably benefits from selling this cursed property over and over to unsuspecting outsiders." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded. "But what if he's telling the truth? What about the next family, Thomas? The next child?" Thomas looked at his own children huddled together in the wagon. James had his arm protectively around his younger sister, his young face solemn beyond his years. Abigail's eyes were fixed on the mill, as if she could see something there that the others could not. "It's not our responsibility," Thomas insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to think of our own family first." "But if we could end it," Eleanor began. "If no other child need be taken." Thomas's jaw clenched as he wrestled with his conscience. Finally, he sighed in resignation. "1 hour. I'll investigate this journal. If there's nothing of substance, we leave immediately." He left Eleanor and the children at the inn, a small, tidy establishment run by a quiet widow named Mrs. Peabody. The innkeeper asked no questions about their sudden appearance or Thomas's swift departure, merely showed them to a comfortable room with 2 beds and a small fireplace. Thomas made his way to the town records building, where Mrs. Winters greeted him with knowing eyes. "Back so soon, Mr. Harlow? I thought you might be." Silas Codell mentioned a journal written by Sarah Blackwater. Mrs. Winters nodded. "I was wondering if he would tell you about that. It's not officially part of the town records. You understand, more of a personal artifact that's been preserved." She disappeared into a back room, returning with a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "Handle it carefully, if you please. It's quite fragile." The town records confirmed Silas's story. Sarah Blackwater's journal, written in a delicate, educated hand, told a tale of cruelty and ultimate revenge. The first entries, dated from 1795, shortly after her marriage to Thaddius Blackwater, initially portrayed a conventional, if not particularly loving, marriage. Sarah had been the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Portland, wed to Blackwater to cement a business alliance. She had come to Mill Haven as a young bride of 18, ill-prepared for the isolation and hardship of rural life. As the years progressed, the journal entries grew darker. Sarah wrote of her growing horror at her husband's treatment of the mill workers, particularly the orphan children. She documented their names, ages, and fates, a grim ledger of suffering. Some died from accidents with the machinery, others from disease or malnutrition. A few simply disappeared, their absence noted with a question mark in Sarah's careful handwriting. During a late-night inspection of the mill, they sabotaged the support holding the massive millstone upright. The stone fell, crushing Thaddius. With his dying breath, He cursed the children and vowed to return for more souls to work his mill in the afterlife. Sarah, who had tried unsuccessfully to protect the children during her husband's life, committed herself to preventing his return after his death. Her research into folk magic and old rituals suggested that destroying the millstone would break Thaddius's connection to the physical world. But the massive granite will prove too substantial for her to damage alone, and no one in town would assist her, fearing Blackwater's curse. In her final entry, dated 1810, Sarah wrote of her own failing health and her fear that Thaddius would claim more victims. She described hiding a specially consecrated iron chisel in the tower room behind a loose stone in the fireplace. With enough strength and determination, the chisel might succeed where conventional tools had failed. "I leave this record," she wrote, "in the hope that someone braver or stronger than I might complete what I could not. The millstone must be broken. The binding must be severed. Only then will the children, past and future, be safe from Thaddius's eternal malice." Thomas closed the journal, his mind racing. The rational part of him still resisted the notion of ghosts and curses. Yet he could not deny what his family had experienced in the mill. And if there was even a chance that Silas and Sarah were right, that destroying the millstone would end the cycle of supernatural violence, didn't he have a moral obligation to try? He returned the journal to Mrs. Winters, who studied his troubled face with understanding. "You're considering it, aren't you? Trying to break the stone?" Thomas nodded reluctantly. "If what Sarah wrote is true." "It's true," Mrs. Winters assured him. "My own grandmother was a child in Mill Haven when the Prescott boy was taken in 1853. She spoke of it until her dying day, how the mill machinery would run on its own, how whispers could be heard from inside even when no one was there. Why has no one attempted to destroy the millstone in all these years?" Mrs. Winters sighed heavily. "Fear, Mr. Harlow. Simple human fear. After each incident, the mill stands empty for years. The memories fade. New owners arrive, unaware of the history. By the time the whispers begin again, it's usually too late." She paused, fixing him with a penetrating gaze. "But you have an advantage. You know what to look for and you have time. Barely, but time nonetheless." Armed with this knowledge, Thomas returned to the inn to find his family resting. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the snow fall in thick flakes that obscured the view of the street below. The children slept on one of the beds, exhausted from their disrupted night and the morning's hasty departure. The milling floor was silent and still in the afternoon light. The millstone sat innocuously in its place, giving no hint of its supernatural significance. Thomas approached it cautiously, chisel in hand. "I know what you are," he said aloud, feeling somewhat foolish but compelled to continue. "I know what you've done. It ends today." He positioned the chisel against the stone and raised his hammer. As the first blow struck, sending a small chip of granite flying, an unholy shriek filled the mill. The temperature plummeted, and the machinery around him began to move of its own accord. "The wheel turns, the stone grinds," a voice thundered, no longer a whisper, but a roar that shook the building's foundation. "Thomas!" Eleanor cried, clutching the children to her. "Thomas, be careful." Thomas steeled himself and struck again and again. Each blow chipped away a small piece of the millstone, and with each piece the supernatural resistance grew. Unseen forces pushed against him, trying to wrest the chisel from his grasp. The wooden mechanisms around him creaked and groaned, threatening to collapse. "Get back!" he shouted to his family. "Stay by the door, ready to run if necessary." Eleanor nodded, pulling the children toward the mill entrance. James clung to his mother, wide-eyed with terror, but Abigail's gaze remained fixed on something only she could see. "She's helping," the girl announced calmly. "Sarah is holding him back." A ghostly figure began to appear near the stone. A tall man in outdated clothing, his face twisted with rage. Thaddius Blackwater looked much as he had in life, broad-shouldered and imposing with a heavy beard and cold, merciless eyes. But there was something profoundly wrong about his appearance. A translucence that revealed the machinery behind him, a flickering quality like a candle flame in a draft. Behind him, shadowy forms of children appeared, their expressions hollow and resigned. Thin, ghost-like figures in tattered clothing. They moved with the jerky mechanical motions of puppets, their eyes vacant and staring. "They belong to me," the apparition of Thaddius Blackwater snarled. "As will your children if you continue." Thomas faltered, his resolve wavering. Then another figure appeared, a woman in a simple dress, her presence somehow warmer and more substantial than Thaddeus's wrathful spirit. Sarah Blackwater's ghost stood between her husband and the Harlow family, her face set in determined lines. "Strike true," she urged, her voice the same that had whispered warnings through the mill. "Free them. Free all of us." With renewed determination, Thomas continued his assault on the millstone. A crack appeared, then widened with each successive blow. The spirit of Thaddius Blackwater howled in fury and desperation as his anchor to the physical world began to fail. "You fool!" the specter raged. "You understand nothing. Without me, this town is nothing. I built it. I own it. I own them all." Sarah's spirit remained steadfast, though her form seemed to flicker and fade with each of Thaddeus's outbursts. "Hurry," she urged Thomas. "I cannot hold him much longer." The ghost children began to stir, their vacant expressions showing the first flickers of awareness and hope. One by one, they turned their gazes toward the cracking millstone as if waking from a long and terrible dream. Eleanor watched in horrified fascination from her position by the door. She had never truly believed in ghosts or spirits, despite the strange occurrences they had experienced. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence before her, she found her worldview shifting dramatically. These were not mere hallucinations or tricks of the light. These were souls tortured, trapped souls. And her husband was fighting to free them. "Mama," Abigail whispered, tugging at her mother's skirt. "Mama, they're coming." "Who's coming, darling?" Eleanor asked, tearing her gaze from the supernatural confrontation by the millstone. "The others," Abigail replied simply. "The ones he took before." As if summoned by the child's words, more ghostly figures began to appear throughout the mill. Children from different eras, their clothing and appearances spanning the century since Thaddius Blackwater's death. A boy in 1850s attire, his face bearing the same hollow-eyed resignation as the earlier victims. A girl from perhaps the 1890s, her pinafore torn and dirty. Others less distinct but no less present, gathering to witness the destruction of their tormentor's anchor to the physical world. Thaddeus's spirit turned on these newcomers, his face contorted with malevolent rage. "Back to work," he commanded. "The wheel turns, the stone grinds." But his power was waning. With each chip Thomas struck from the millstone, the ghost's form grew less substantial, his voice less commanding. The spirit children stood their ground, no longer cowering before their former master. With a final tremendous effort, Thomas brought the hammer down. The millstone split in two with a sound like thunder. A blinding light filled the mill, accompanied by a rush of wind that nearly knocked Thomas off his feet. The ghostly children raised their faces to the light, their expressions transforming from resignation to joy. One by one, they began to fade not into darkness, but into the light, their forms dissolving like morning mist beneath the sun. Thomas sank to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. It was over. Unwrapping it, he found a small leather pouch containing several gold coins and a folded note written in Sarah Blackwater's careful hand. "To whoever has the courage to break the stone. These few coins are all I managed to hide from Thaddius during our marriage. They represent the wages he never paid to the children who suffered under his cruelty. Use them as you see fit, but know that they were meant to secure a future for those who had none." Thomas showed the note and coins to Eleanor. "What should we do with them?" he asked. Eleanor considered for a moment. "I think Sarah would want them used to help children. Perhaps we could establish some kind of fund for the orphans in Portland." Thomas nodded in agreement. A fitting memorial to those who suffered here. In the days that followed, Thomas Harlow made a decision that surprised the townspeople of Mill Haven. Rather than selling the mill or abandoning it, he chose to restore it, not as a home for his family, but as a memorial. The damaged millstone was left in place, its broken halves a testament to the victory over a century-old evil. Working with the town council, Thomas established the Blackwater Memorial Fund, using Sarah's gold coins as seed money. The fund provided support for orphan children throughout Maine, ensuring they received education, proper care, and protection from exploitation. The Harlow family moved into a proper house in town, where Thomas established himself as a respectable merchant. But he made regular visits to the mill, ensuring it remained standing as a reminder of the children who had suffered there and of Sarah Blackwater's long vigil. The interior of the mill was converted into a small museum of sorts, documenting the building's history, both natural and supernatural. Sarah's journal was displayed prominently, along with testimonies from the Harlows and previous inhabitants who had experienced the mill's whispers. Some visitors scoffed at these tales of ghosts and curses, but others, particularly those who lingered in the tower room near sunset, reported a peculiar sense of peace, as if a long-standing wrong had finally been set right. In time, the whispers faded from local memory. 50 years passed, then 100, with no recurrence of the supernatural events that had plagued the mill for generations. The broken millstone remained in place, a silent guardian against the return of Thaddius Blackwater. Yet rumors persisted of a benevolent presence in the old mill, a woman in outdated dress who sometimes appeared to lost children, guiding them safely home. The people of Mill Haven came to call her the miller's wife. Though few remembered her true name or story, the wheel had turned for the final time. The stone had ground its last, and in the silence that followed, those who had suffered found their long-awaited peace. As for the Harlow family, they thrived in Mill Haven. Thomas established a successful general store that served the community for decades. Eleanor became known for her compassionate work with orphan children, establishing a small school that ensured no child in their town would ever again suffer from neglect or exploitation. James Harlow grew up to become a respected architect, his designs influenced by his early experiences in the mill. He developed a particular interest in repurposing old industrial buildings for new uses, preserving their history while giving them new life. Several of his renovated mills still stand throughout New England, each bearing a small plaque commemorating the orphaned workers of the 19th century. Abigail, perhaps most affected by the supernatural events of her childhood, maintained a special sensitivity to things others couldn't see. She became a noted author of children's books, her stories often featuring brave young heroines who helped lost spirits find their way home. When asked about her inspiration, she would smile mysteriously and speak of a kind lady who had once whispered warnings to save her family. In her later years, she would tell her grandchildren about the winter they spent in the old mill and of the brave woman who had whispered warnings across time to save them. Her grandchildren, in turn, passed the story down through generations, ensuring that Sarah Blackwater's century-long vigil would not be forgotten. And if occasionally visitors to Mill Haven reported hearing a woman's voice near the abandoned mill, a voice that whispered, "They are free now," well, that was simply part of local folklore. A story told on winter evenings when the wind howled and shadows gathered in the corners of old rooms. In 1953, exactly 50 years after the Harlows broke the millstone, a group of historians and paranormal researchers descended on Mill Haven to investigate the legends surrounding Blackwater Mill. They came equipped with cameras, recording devices, and the latest scientific instruments for detecting supernatural phenomena. They spent a week in the old building, setting up their equipment in the areas most associated with the hauntings: the milling floor, the tower room, the mill race. They conducted seances, took hundreds of photographs, and recorded hours of audio tape in hopes of capturing evidence of the spirits that supposedly haunted the mill. They found nothing. No unexplained cold spots, no ghostly voices on their recordings, no apparitions in their photographs, no machinery moving on its own. The mill stood silent and empty, a mere historical curiosity rather than a supernatural nexus. On their final night, as the researchers were packing their equipment, a young assistant wandered to the broken millstone, still on display as Thomas Harlow had left it. Idly, he ran his fingers along the fracture line, wondering at the story behind it. The wheel turns no more, A woman's voice whispered so close to his ear that he spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind him. But he was alone in the fading light. When he reported the incident to his colleagues, they dismissed it as imagination or a trick of the wind through the old building. Their instruments had detected nothing, after all. Scientifically speaking, Blackwater Mill was just an old building, nothing more. But the young man knew what he had heard. And as he left Mill Haven the next day, he could have sworn he saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing in the tower window, watching him go. When he blinked, she was gone. After all, every town has its ghost stories. But not every ghost story ends with redemption. Tonight, as the wheel of time continues its eternal rotation, remember the whispers of Blackwater Mill. Remember that some echoes persist long after their original sound has faded. And perhaps most importantly, remember that even the darkest curse can be broken by those with the courage to confront it. The wheel turns no longer. The stone grinds no more. And in that silence lies a victory that spans generations, a testament to the enduring power of truth against the grinding weight of forgotten history. Today, Blackwater Mill still stands on the banks of the Quebec River, though time has not been kind to its weathered timbers. The roof sags in places, and ivy climbs the stone foundation, nature slowly reclaiming what man built. The town of Mill Haven has grown around it, transforming from a rural outpost to a quaint New England community proud of its historical character. In 2003, exactly 100 years after the Harlows broke Thaddius Blackwater's curse, the Mill Haven Historical Society undertook a renovation of the old mill. The structure had fallen into disrepair, deemed unsafe for the curious tourists who occasionally ventured inside despite the no trespassing signs. Preservationists argued that the building represented an important piece of Maine's industrial heritage, regardless of the supernatural legends associated with it. The renovation project was led by Professor Daniel Harlow, a great-grandson of Thomas and Eleanor, who had inherited both his ancestors' architectural drawings of the mill and a fascination with its dark history. As a historian specializing in New England folklore, Daniel approached the project with dual perspectives: scientific skepticism and a deep respect for the stories that had shaped his family legacy. The workers hired for the renovation reported no supernatural occurrences, no whispers, no machinery moving on its own, no unexplained cold spots. The broken millstone remained the centerpiece of the ground floor, now protected by a glass enclosure with a plaque detailing its historical significance. If the plaque also mentioned the legends of hauntings and curses, it did so in the detached academic tone of folklore analysis rather than spiritual belief. On February 17, 2003, exactly 200 years after Thaddius Blackwater's death, Daniel Harlow stayed alone in the mill, a scientific experiment of sorts. He brought recording equipment, cameras, and various instruments to measure temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic fields. He set everything up methodically, then sat in the tower room as darkness fell, waiting for something, anything. The night passed uneventfully. No whispers disturbed the silence. No ghostly figures materialized in the darkness. Even the old rocking chair remained motionless. By dawn, Daniel had begun to pack his equipment, a mixture of disappointment and relief in his heart. Perhaps the legends were just that, legends born from superstition and perpetuated by imagination. As he prepared to leave, he made one final circuit of the building, checking that everything was secure. In the main milling room, he paused by the broken millstone, its jagged edges still sharp after a century of exposure. On impulse, he placed his hand on the cold granite. "I don't know if you're still here somehow, Sarah," he said aloud, feeling slightly foolish. "But if you are, I want you to know that your sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Your story lives on." No dramatic response came. No ghostly whisper. No sudden chill. No spectral appearance. Just the ordinary sounds of an old building creaking in the morning sun. Daniel smiled ruefully at his own sentimentality and turned to leave. That's when he noticed it. A small leather-bound book lying on the floor near the exit. He was certain it hadn't been there moments before. Puzzled, he picked it up and opened it to find blank pages except for a single sentence written on the first page in elegant feminine handwriting. "Some victories echo through time, remembered by those who listen for the whispers of the past." Daniel searched the entire mill but found no explanation for the book's sudden appearance. No one had entered. No one could have placed it there without his noticing. He took the book with him when he left, adding it to the collection of Blackwater Mill artifacts maintained by his family. Skeptics might suggest that Daniel simply overlooked the book earlier, or that he brought it himself and forgot. Perhaps stress and sleep deprivation played tricks on his perception. Rational explanations exist, as they always do for seemingly supernatural occurrences. But Daniel Harlow knows what he experienced. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he swears he can hear a woman's voice just on the edge of perception, whispering words of gratitude. Not words of warning any longer, but of peace finally achieved after centuries of vigilance. The mill stands today as a museum telling the intertwined stories of industrial progress, human cruelty, supernatural vengeance, and ultimately redemption. Visitors can see the broken millstone, read Sarah's journal, now preserved behind climate-controlled glass, and learn about the Harlow family's role in breaking a centuries-old curse. Most tourists treat these stories as entertaining folklore New England ghost tales perfect for October evenings. They take photographs, buy souvenirs from the gift shop, and leave with amusing anecdotes to share with friends. But some visitors, particularly children, report a different experience. They speak of a kind woman in old-fashioned clothes who appears briefly in reflections or shadows. A woman who smiles at them with gentle eyes before fading from view. The docents have learned to expect these reports and respond with practiced neutrality, neither confirming nor denying the possibility of Sarah Blackwater's continued presence. Is the mill truly haunted? Did the breaking of the millstone really end a supernatural cycle of vengeance? Or was it merely coincidence that no further tragedies occurred after 1903? Did Thomas Harlow confront actual spirits? Or was his experience the product of suggestion, stress, and the power of local legend? These questions have no definitive answers. But perhaps definitive answers aren't the point of such stories. Perhaps what matters is the truth that lies beneath the supernatural elements. The recognition that cruelty leaves lasting scars, that injustice demands reckoning, that the powerful are not immune to consequences, and that courage in the face of evil, whether human or supernatural, is the noblest expression of the human spirit. The wheel turns no longer. The stone grinds no more. But the whispers of Blackwater Mill continue to echo through time, carrying their message to those willing to listen. Some victories transcend death itself, and some stories never truly end.